All right, so before we kind of jump into things, a couple things about the exam before we kind of start review, and just stuff with the class. So no new material this week, so there's no module quiz. However, we will start right up on the next module next week. So after class Thursday, after the in-class exam, which is Thursday, you'll see the module 10 reading pop up, all right? That'll be due by the end of the day next Monday, and we'll kind of be back into kind of the typical kind of flow of things, right? So I probably won't have time or waste time mentioning that during the exam on Thursday, so I'm mentioning it now, okay? Excuse me. Also, it should now be reflected on Canvas. I went through this morning. Those last two questions were just opinion-based. It should have updated all the scores to give, as long as you submitted an answer, everyone should have gotten full credit for those last two questions on that Module 9 quiz. I have also, this is where if you see something, say something to me. I think when I uploaded the video from last Thursday, something must have happened as I uploaded because it's not there anymore. And I know that I for sure downloaded it and uploaded it to YouTube. So when I get back to my office, I'll make sure that recording is there as well as the one from today, okay? Other than that, the exam will look very similar to the first. Kind of get here, be prompt. We'll get going as soon as kind of, there's an earlier section. I'll try to get everybody out. And we'll get everyone in here and started right at 11:10. We'll hand the exams out. You should have something to write with and a non-graphing calculator. Nothing else should be out. Once we get the exams handed out, I've got blank paper if you want some additional scrap paper. What else? Oh, the formula sheet or those equations will be on the back sheet of the exam. So you'll kind of have those like within the exam. It's not an extra sheet of paper or anything. It's kind of right on that back page. Other than that, it'll look pretty similar to the first in terms of the logistics. So unless there's any other questions for me, the only other thing I wanted to mention logistically is if you do have an accommodation or an AES form that you've given me, I should have emailed you already and you should have responded to me. So if you haven't seen that email, make sure you reach out to me today. Otherwise, I think we should be set and ready to go for Thursday's exam. Any logistical questions for me before we dive into content? Yeah. So just like the last one, 25 questions, right? Multiple choice. There might be a bonus question. So if you get them all right, you could get 104 out of 100 possible points. Yep. Okay. So I think I know what you're referencing. I've got a question that I'm going to start with. You're talking about like Giffen good stuff? Or from this last? So I think, are you talking about like HHI calculations? What are you talking about then? Well, it's not hard for me to answer that. I guess if you remember, let me know after class. I think the extent to which I think some things that look a little bit different in the practice exams would be the income substitution effect, which I'll go over today, and then also HHI, four-firm concentration ratio. As far as we got in class, some of the practice problems maybe went a little bit more in depth. So I'll show you the kind of questions I would ask you on those two topics. Other than that, I don't think there should be anything else that was in those problems that we haven't talked about. But yeah, for those two things, we'll make sure we review questions that I tell you this is the extent of which I would want your knowledge to be for these types of questions. Yep. Any other logistical questions before you? Okay, so even though the class recording failed, the extra video I promised to put up on Friday didn't, so that's been up there on Friday, and it dives a little bit deeper into income and substitution effects, okay? So there's two questions that look kind of similar to this on the practice exam. One goes a little bit more in depth, and one is probably not as in depth as what you would see on the exam. So I'm going to kind of show you a combination of the two, or the types of questions I would expect you to know how to answer for income versus substitution effects when we're thinking about consumer optimum, okay? So I think in the question, I'll vary it a little bit. Let's say we have two goods, and I tell you there's an increase in the price of ramen, right? So anytime we have a price change, we're going to have two different types of effects, okay? So one will be the substitution effect. The other would be our income effect. So anytime I give you a price change, you should be able to tell me what happens to the two different goods that we're thinking about. So anytime you have a price change and you're asked about income substitution effects, I would set something up that looks similar to this, right? Now, I would give you additional information about whether they're inferior or normal goods, right? So this looks more like question 25. I think question 26 was just asking about one normal good. But I could do something like this. I give you two goods. I tell you if they're inferior or normal. I then give you a price change. This is what you have, okay? For the substitution effect, this is simply I buy more of whatever is relatively cheaper, and I buy less of whatever is relatively more expensive. So if the price of ramen goes up, my substitution effect doesn't depend on what type of good it is at all. The substitution effect will tell me if the price of ramen goes up, am I going to buy more or less of that than before? Less, it's relatively more expensive. But if the price of caviar, this other good, stays the same, if ramen is more expensive, what's happened to the relative price of caviar? Its price stayed the same, but other goods are more expensive, so its relative prices went down. Should I buy more or less of it? More. So the substitution effect will always be working in opposite directions for these two goods. I buy more of whatever is relatively cheaper, less of whatever is relatively more expensive. I could have a similar example where I do a price decrease. That would just flip these two. Now for the income effect, I can think about anytime I have a price change, that's going to change my real income. The amount of money I have in my pocket hasn't changed. My income didn't change. But what is my real income? It's income over prices. If the price of a good went up, what happened to my real income? Well, if the denominator is larger, my real income actually went down. I can buy fewer things than I could before. So a price increase would actually cause my real income to go down. Now it's back to all the way. This is where the class isn't cumulative, but it's comprehensive. Module 3, if I have an increase in income for normal goods, I would buy more of them. So if I have a decrease in income for normal goods, I'm going to buy less. For inferior goods like ramen, when my real income goes down, I'm actually going to buy more, right? So I'm going to expect you to know how to identify substitution and income effects for two different goods, maybe two different types of goods, just giving you that initial price change, okay? That's the extent to which I'll expect you to know this. Now, what the questions go into, like on 25 or some of the practice problems that were at the end, and I actually gave you the answer to one of those quiz questions. Let's say I told you that this was the total effect, okay? So I won't ask you this in the exam, but just to kind of a complete, if this was the total effect, which one of these impacts had to be larger? The income effect, right? They're both pushing it in opposite directions. If the total effect is I buy more, it must have been that the income effect was larger than the substitution effect. Well, this is kind of counterintuitive. If the price of a good goes up, I actually buy more of it. These are these weird goods where if the income effect, if it was inferior and the income effect was larger than the substitution, we can end up with a Giffen good. I won't expect you to know any of this on the exam. The extent to which I will ask you questions about the income and substitution effect is what directional changes would happen to two goods. They could be normal or inferior from an initial price change. Right? So this is the only portion that you would have to kind of worry about on the exam. Okay? Any questions on that idea?
So one of them is like the income effect is negative or positive. What is that exactly?
So if we go back to module 3, if I have normal goods, when I have more income, I buy more of them. If I have an inferior good, if I have more income, I buy less. That's a positive or negative income effect, right? Or increase or decreases the quantity I'm buying. In terms of if I say positive or negative? Yeah, if I increase the quantity I'm buying, what was the change? A positive change. If I decrease the quantity I'm buying, it's just two different ways of saying the same thing. Yeah. Any other questions on this one? Okay. So the video kind of goes through a different type of example, kind of similar to this. So if you want some additional review or an additional question, because everybody's asking me for more questions, which I'll give the same advice to everybody. Quantity is not always better in this class. In fact, you can run these through AIs and try to have them produce questions. There's going to be a lot more variance because the type of questions it's pulling from on the internet, some of them are from easier classes, AP Micro, easier than this class, more simple versions, could be pulling from more complex courses. So you're going to have more variance in the type of questions you see. If you have more variance in the type of questions you see, is that actually going to be a good or bad thing in terms of studying for this course's exam? Bad. All right, so you can use AI if you want, and some of those questions will be fine and dandy, but I can't promise that it's not going to be pulling from easier or more difficult question banks, right? So I would focus on the practice exam, the old quizzes, and the old practice problems. If you can provide a graph or like something like this, sometimes it'll be like just directional changes or equations that supports why the correct answer is what it is, that would take you a pretty good amount of time, right, to work through every single one of those problems and what I just mentioned and provide a support for why the correct answer is what it is. That's what I would focus on first. But if you want additional questions, that video is another good one where I would give you kind of a slightly different setup, okay? All right. Before I field the class for questions, since you asked about it earlier, the other thing that might look a little bit different than the practice problems, I'll actually simplify it a little bit. Just like I simplified that last one, I'm not going to ask you about total effects, given goods, and relative sizes of the income to the substitution effect. What I will ask you about for that 4-firm concentration ratio and for the HHI, there's some problems where I give you sales and then like you would have to convert them into percentages. On the exam, I will simply give you the market share as in terms of a percent for these firms. So I'm not going to ask you to calculate it, taking their sales, dividing it by the total sales in the industry, multiplying it by 100. I'll just tell you what the percentage is. So for example, if I have 2 firms evenly splitting the market, what would the market share as a percent be for each firm? Well, so the 4-firm concentration ratio would be what? So I saw some people mouth it. I'll start over. If I have 2 firms evenly splitting market share, each firm would have a total of 50%. So what would my 4-firm concentration ratio be? I'm simply adding up the market share in terms of a percentage for each of the top 4 firms. If there's only 2 firms, I only have 2 to add up, I've got 100. Now, what if I had 4 firms evenly splitting market share? It would be what? 25 plus 25 plus 25 plus 25. I would have the exact same 4-firm concentration ratio. So a possible answer could be, when I see a change in the number of firms, what happens to my 4-firm concentration ratio? If I go from 2 to 4 firms, and I'm taking the market share of the top 4, it's going to be exactly the same, right? Now, if I add a 5th firm, what do I know has to happen to my 4-firm concentration ratio? It would have to go, or the lower these values are, the more concentrated or more competitive a market is. But with that 4-firm concentration, I can't distinguish between those kind of really uncompetitive markets at the top. Now, my HHI, if I think about a similar example, what would the HHI be? Well, what we do there is we take the market share in terms of a percentage and square it for every single firm that exists in that market. I'm not going to give you 10 or 11 where this takes you a lot of time. I'm going to be focused probably more on directional changes. So if I told you that there's 2 firms evenly splitting market share, what would the HHI be? 50 squared plus 50 squared, which I think should give me 5,000. What if I only had 1 firm? What should happen to my HHI? If it measures the level of market concentration, right? If I only have 1 firm, more of the market share will be concentrated with 1 firm, so my HHI should be greater than 5,000. If I wanted to calculate the actual value, if I had 1 firm, or what we would call a monopoly, 100 squared, sure enough, it was higher than 5,000, it was 10,000. So the higher this HHI, the less competitive the market is, or the more concentrated the market share is with 1 firm. Now, without calculating it, let's say I went from still having 2 firms, but one of them now has 90% of the market share. So now I've got kind of this 90-10 split. If I didn't want to waste time entering this into my calculator and I simply asked you, I gave you like a multiple choice, is the HHI going to be greater than or less than 5,000? So is this market more concentrated with 1 firm than it was before? Yes, if this is a measure of market concentration, my new value should be higher than it was before. If I actually go through and calculate this, I think I get 8,200 if I'm doing math in my head correct, right? So you can actually calculate it and prove to yourself that what the directional change is. But you can also, like, I'm just going to focus on asking you about those directional changes. Now, if instead of going from a 2-firm split, let's say I have that similar example where I couldn't tell the difference before, with my HHI, what's going to be true if I now have 4 firms evenly splitting demand? Well, I could go through and enter this into my calculator, worrying about making a math mistake. But if I now have 4 firms, right, evenly splitting the market share, what should be true about my new HHI relative to before? Should be less than before. If I go through and actually calculate it, I can prove that to myself. But if I'm just asking for the directional change, you can save yourself a little bit of time for other questions on the exam when we're, if we're working through these. Okay? So these equations aren't on that equation sheet. These are going to be things that you just simply need to know. The 4-firm concentration ratio, you just add up the market share of the top 4 firms. The HHI, you add up the market share squared of all firms. Okay? So it looks a little bit different than some of the types of questions you saw at the end of those practice problems. They should be easier. I'm not asking you to calculate the market share. I would be directly giving it to you like in these problems here. Okay? Any questions over anything here? Okay? Any questions that people want to see worked through? Positive, negative externalities from. So I think this is a common thing that people, I guess, are misunderstanding. It doesn't matter whether or not a positive or negative externality comes from the production or consumption of a good. If you've been in class, how did I say you always model a positive externality? Through the, well, a positive externality is an additional benefit or cost. What is modeling benefits? So we always model positive externalities through the demand curve. Negative externalities is additional cost, so I always model them through the, that's the only 2 ways you need to know how to model them. Those are the easiest ways to model a positive and negative externality. You can technically model them through the opposite. So there are technically 4 ways to model positive and negative externalities. I guess if you want me to, I can go through them today and make you know all of them, right? But I've only expected you to know how to model it in 2 ways. Now, they lead to the same answers. So if you've done additional work and you know how to model it through the supply or demand curve, it'll still result in you getting the exact same values. But the more intuitive results coming from modeling a positive externality through the demand curve and modeling a negative externality through the supply curve. So if in terms of like saying, is it a production or consumption externality? I told someone else this. Maybe it's a good way of explaining it. Maybe it's not. I think sometimes I know how to do this, but we can always be better, right? I could say that if I go left, I'm 38. If I go right, I'm 38. So does knowing if I go left or right change what my age is? I can have a positive consumption externality or a positive production externality. What type of externality is it? Positive. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It's still a positive externality. We would still model it through the demand curve, right? So I wouldn't, I know that kind of there was a question on one of the early quizzes. It was supposed to be easy because identifying if it is a production or consumption externality just tells me is it coming from the production or consumption of a good. It was something I told you that should have been an easy, like I was trying to make that question a little bit easier, right? But all we care in terms of modeling it is it a positive or is it a negative externality? Is that what you were kind of asking? Yes? Okay. We can talk about deadweight loss. I don't think I've ever used the word overhead in this class, so I probably won't work through that. So in terms of calculating deadweight loss, like what type of deadweight loss? We have tons of different types of markets. We've looked at taxes, subsidies. Okay. So if I've got taxes, right? And this is where maybe I'll kind of answer some of the questions along the way. I'm going to build out a more complete version for you. Because if I ask you about something like what's the price consumers pay, what can I also ask you about? The price that the sellers keep, right? So this is where, this isn't like when people say tell me the practice exam doesn't match up with the actual exam. Well, no, it's going to be slightly different questions. But if you understand this model, you can identify both the price the consumer pays, and if I asked you on the exam the price the seller keeps, you could also do that. Trying to be expressive, so if you're looking just at the slides, maybe look at my face a little bit to know what might be coming up on the exam, right? So if I've got a model where I'm looking at supply, demand, supply represents marginal cost, demand represents marginal benefits. Here's kind of my equilibrium market quantity and my equilibrium market price, okay? If I have a tax, this is once again, we can tax producers or consumers, we can subsidize consumers or producers. You'll notice in all these practice materials, if you look at the old quiz questions, I only model taxes to the producers and I'm only giving you subsidies to the consumers. I'm trying to make it a little bit more simplified, right? I could add in the other ones, it gets a little more tricky, but that's all I'm gonna expect you to know. Think about taxes on producers, subsidies to consumers. So if I have a tax, right? What's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve plus the tax? That difference is simply the value of the tax, right? When I have a tax, before we kind of work through this, who is a tax going to be bad for? If I'm talking about producer and consumer surplus, if I have a tax, what happens to both of those? They actually both decrease, right? So with taxes, producer and consumer surplus will both decrease. We'll think about visual depiction as to why in a second. Well, what is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. What represents the marginal benefit to consumers? The quicker you answer my questions, the more problems we get through today. The marginal benefit to consumers is the demand curve. What's the marginal cost to a consumer? Not the supply curve. The price that they pay, right? So the marginal cost is going to be the price they pay. With a tax, we no longer have one single price. We now have a price the consumer pays, but when you hand over $100, if the tax is 20, how much does the seller keep? Only 80. So there's a difference between the price the consumer pays now and the price the seller keeps. So if I think about producer surplus, it's simply the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to producers. What represents producers' marginal costs? Supply. If we don't know this, Thursday's going to be rough. What's the marginal benefit to producers when you sell something? The price, or here after a tax, the price the sellers keep. So if I'm telling you ahead of time, and this is something you should know going into the exam, a tax hurts both producer and consumer surplus. So if consumer surplus goes down, what must have happened to the price they paid? That price must have went up. So the new price in the market after that tax, that's going to be a higher price than the old equilibrium. This should represent the price the consumer pays. Now, how much does the seller get to keep? Whatever I pay minus the tax. So the price that the seller keeps, well, what's the value of the tax? It's just the difference between the supply curve plus the tax and the supply curve. So what has happened? The price that the seller keeps goes down. The price the consumer pays goes up. Is that going to be a bad thing for consumers? Yes. Is that a bad thing for producers? Yes, sure enough, both of them are going to be hurt. Now, if we think about actually calculating where those surplus values are, where is producer surplus? The difference between that supply curve and the price they now get to keep, but only up to that new quantity that we would see after the tax. Okay? Now, if I gave you these values, and I think problem 5 and 6, they had the actual values to this, this is where understanding the concepts, the math should be easy, right? So like if I know that this is 10, 40, 60, and 100, producer surplus would just be what? 30 times 60 times a half. They're just an area of a triangle. I said a non-technical way of remembering this, producer surplus is always going to be the triangle on the, or the area on the bottom. Right? Now, what if I think about consumer surplus? Right? Well, where would that be? It's the price below the demand curve, but above the new price they pay. So consumer surplus would simply be this area here. Right? So relative to before, what would have producer surplus been? Well, if I had the old equilibrium price, the difference between that old equilibrium market price and the supply curve, producer surplus would have been this entire area. Consumer surplus, the area between the price and the demand curve, would have been this entire area. So consumer surplus went down, producer surplus went down, okay? So after this tax, right, who do we now also have factored into this equation? The government. Are they going to benefit or be worse off after a tax? Right? So what do they earn? We said they earn tax revenue, which is simply whatever that tax is times the quantity sold after the tax. A less technical way of remembering that, what would the height of this rectangle be? It's the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the tax. So it would be the value of the tax times what's the base, the quantity after the tax. This rectangle would be my government tax revenue, right? So what did I lose from this tax? Well, the total surplus would be producer plus consumer plus government revenue. If the market had remained at equilibrium, all of this surplus that we would have had is now lost or would now represent our deadweight loss. It's just the area of a triangle. Once I have these values, I think this was like 80, 40, 60, and 100. That'd be what? 40 times 40 times a half, so 800, if I'm doing math in my head correct. But yeah, once we know what area we're looking for, these values, I'm going to change them on the exam. So it's a matter of being able to identify that area. Now it's just the area of a triangle. Okay? Or kind of notice, what is our deadweight loss with a tax? What is total surplus to society? Well, if we don't care about where those marginal benefits or costs come from, we have a question? Maybe take your earphone out. So what would the marginal benefit be for total surplus? Or sorry, what would total surplus, the marginal benefit would be represented by what? My demand curve. If I don't care about who it comes from, what's my marginal cost? Represented by the... So notice the difference between my demand and supply curve. For all the units I'm no longer selling, that's the loss of total surplus, or this little triangle over here. Another way I can kind of think about why is it not this triangle? Think about it this way. With a tax, what's true about where the market would be without the tax? It would be at a higher quantity. So the triangle is going to point to where the market would be, or is pointing to the right. If we talk about subsidies, it'll be the exact opposite. Right? So I think with these values, like I said, the value of the tax here was 40. Quantity after the tax was 60. That was one of the questions, was to calculate tax revenue. One of the questions was to identify the price the consumer pays. It was this higher price of 80. If I had asked you for the price the seller keeps, it would have been what? This lower price of 40, right? If I asked you for the quantity after the tax, it would have been that quantity of 60. So I could ask you about any one of these or any combination of these things, right? I could ask you to calculate me producer or consumer surplus. We identified those as the triangle at the top and the bottom. Tax revenue was kind of this large rectangle in the middle, right? So I could ask you about any one of those things, okay? So is there any question kind of from 5, 6, or 7 that I didn't touch on there that someone has a question on when we're looking at that model? Okay, so that's a pretty complete version of all the types of questions I could ask you. You could have to calculate consumer, producer surplus, tax revenue, identify the price the seller keeps, the price the consumer pays. I could identify the value of the tax. So this is one where people make a very easy mistake, and this is meant to be an easy question. How do I identify the value of the tax? It's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve plus the tax. So it's the vertical difference between those two curves at the same quantity. So here, the only way I can identify it at that same quantity, the difference between 80 and 40 is 40. I don't compare the old and new equilibrium. That would tell me the size of the tax is 30. That's not right, right? Right? It's the vertical difference between those two curves, but at the same quantity, okay? All right, I know we went through that kind of quick. Any questions on that one before we keep moving? Okay. Yeah, then we'll come over here. Yep, yeah, you. Yeah, so if we're thinking about 23, we're now thinking more about consumer optimum type questions, right? So I'll give you kind of a visual depiction, but that kind of helps us remember this key concept, right? So, and I notice a lot of confusion here that people cannot understand why, when I'm spending optimally, the slope of my budget constraint should be the same as the slope of my indifference curve, right? Everyone looks at this and says, well, why isn't it the change in the quantity of y over the quantity of x? If you look at all those practice problems, you look at all the quiz questions, do I ever give you the quantities? No, I'm giving you prices and marginal utilities. So where the slopes come from, if we had quantities, yes, we could do the change in the quantity of y over the change in the quantity of x. But we don't even need to know the quantities. What is the slope of my budget constraint always going to be? Once again, if we don't know this, this is not going to bode well for Thursday. All right, so if I'm only buying X, how much can I afford to buy? My income divided by the price of that good. If I'm only buying Y, we said we could afford to buy whatever my income is over the prices of the Y good. If I use, these represent quantities, right? So if I look at the change in the quantity of Y, I would have M over the price of Y divided by a change in the quantity of X between these two extreme points. If I just rearrange this equation a little bit, I do the algebra, all this is really saying is the slope of that budget constraint will always be my relative prices, but it's the price of X over the price of Y. It's counterintuitive because the graph is using quantities. When we talk about the slope in terms of prices, it ends up being counterintuitive, or X is always in my numerator. If it helps to remember, when you're looking at these consumer optimum problems, what is always in my numerator? X. What is always in my denominator? The Y good. That's counterintuitive because we're not using the quantities. We're using what is behind those quantities. And so it ends up being this kind of counterintuitive result. What did we say the slope of the indifference curve, what did we call it? The marginal rate of substitution, which was the relative marginal utility. So the marginal utility of good X over the marginal utility of good Y. In these consumer optimums, X always goes on top. And it's because we're not using the quantities, we're using prices and marginal utilities, right? So once again, I won't want to waste too much time in kind of going through why this was this, but it's a very similar idea to the fact that the quantities from my indifference curve, behind those, there's an equation that uses marginal utilities, which is why this ends up getting flipped. Similar idea to down here. Okay? So what I know is true when I'm maximizing my total utility. The slope of my budget constraint is the same as the slope of my indifference curve, which represents my marginal rate of substitution. If I just rearrange these equations a little bit, what I end up with is the marginal utility per dollar at that consumer optimum will be where the marginal utility per dollar spent on both goods is exactly the same. Okay? So I'm going to use this in a lot of different problems, the fact that this is going to be true. Okay? It's two different ways of saying the same thing. Saying the marginal utility per dollar is the same for both goods is the same as saying the slope of the budget constraint is the same as the slope of the indifference curve. Okay? So now to your actual question, I'm going a little bit more in depth because I think it's probably useful to know these, right? So I've got two different goods. Right? And I'm told the marginal utility of both goods, so 10 and 15, and I'm told the prices are 2 and 1. Okay? So what's the marginal utility per dollar of this first good? What's the marginal utility per dollar of this good? They are, in fact, not equal. One of them is larger. So if I am getting more additional utility per dollar I'm spending, do I want to buy more or less of that good? More. I'm getting more additional happiness, more additional utility per dollar I spend. Do I want to buy more of that good or not? I do want to buy more of it, right? So what would happen to the quantities? I would buy more of this good. And because I'm budget constrained or I'm income constrained, inherently that means I would have to buy less of the other good, right? So if I was putting these on a graph, what I would know is that I'm currently spending at a point, or sorry, I reverse these. I'm spending at a point here where I'm not at that consumer optimum. I actually want to buy fewer of these hamburgers, more of the pops, or move towards that point where I'm maximizing my total utility. Now, I don't have to draw the graph out here. What I'm really comparing is what those margin utilities per dollar are. Whatever has a higher margin utility per dollar, I'm buying more of that good, which means inherently because I have a budget constraint, I'm buying less of the other good. Okay? Does that answer? Now I forget who asked the question. Yes? Okay. And then you had a question next, I think. Any other questions on this one? Okay, and then we'll go here, and then we'll go here. 13. All right. So we're looking at positive externalities, and I can use what? Okay. So if I've got a positive externality, so anytime I'm thinking about externalities, I would first draw out where will the market be, right? Nope, sorry. No, I had this. Sorry, I'm writing quick. I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. So I've got quantity, price. So I'm first going to figure out where will the market be, right? Here's the quantity, here's the price. Right? If I have a positive externality, that's telling me that what? At every quantity, there's an additional benefit, which how will I model those? Through my demand curve. So at every point, my benefit to society is whatever the benefit to the consumer was, plus an additional amount. So where does society want this optimal point to be? Well, there's no negative externalities, so the cost of society are the same as the private marginal cost. So where will my marginal social cost be equal to my marginal social benefit? At a higher quantity for society. The market arrives at a quantity that is too low. So society wants more of this good. What's the only thing that we talked about, the only tool the government has to increase quantity? Subsidies, right? So when it comes to a positive externality, the only tool we have is a subsidy. If we did have a negative externality, then we model that through the supply curve, we'll see the exact opposite. The market ends up at a quantity that is too high. So if we want to lower the quantity with a negative externality, we can use what? Taxes, quotas, price ceilings, or price floors. So we have a lot of tools to solve the negative externality. We only have one tool to solve the positive externality problem, right? So here we know that we're going to be using a subsidy and not a tax for positive externalities, right? Because what would a tax do? It would decrease the quantity. We want the market to actually be at a quantity that is higher. Okay? Now, if we use the subsidy, what's going to happen to deadweight loss to society? Well, if I'm thinking about a positive externality, what is deadweight loss if we allow the market to continue to operate here? Once again, we're looking at total surplus, but here you can think about it's like total social surplus would be the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social costs. If the market is operating here, what's the difference for all of these units in this range? The marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal social cost, so we'd be missing out on all of this total surplus. So what does this represent? Deadweight loss. It's surplus that's lost because we allowed the market to operate at a point that was not efficient for society. What does society actually want? Society wants a quantity that is higher, right? The market was too low. Society wants the quantity to be higher. So notice what direction does our deadweight loss triangle point? To the right. Society wants the quantity to be higher. Our deadweight loss triangle points to the right. If you instead were to kind of think about this as a negative externality, so this is where any question you see on these practice problems, think about what if I change this, right? What if I instead change this to be a positive externality? I asked you the exact same thing, but for a negative externality, right? So if I had a negative externality, the quantity in the market is here. If it's a negative externality, at every quantity, there's an additional cost. So my marginal social costs would be higher. There's no positive externality, so the social benefit is still just the benefits to the consumers. So notice, where does marginal social benefit equal marginal social cost? For negative externalities, the quantity the market gets at is too high. So that means what is total social benefit? It's the difference between the marginal social benefit, or sorry, I'm writing this quickly. Total economic social surplus, right? So what I want here is thinking about total economic social surplus. Right? It's the difference between the marginal social benefits to society and the marginal social costs. So for every unit the market overproduces, what is true about the cost to society relative to the marginal benefits? The costs would be higher or lower than the additional benefits? Greater, so the surplus from every unit in this range would actually be negative. So if I allow the market to continue to operate out here, every unit in this range would be creating negative surplus or deadweight loss for society. Right? So notice with a negative externality, what does society actually want? They want a lower quantity. So what direction does my deadweight loss triangle point? To the left. It's not a technical way of remembering this, but it might be kind of a good way to think about the visualization of identifying deadweight loss. Okay. So in this example, if I have a negative externality, what could I use? We said we could use a, well, just in the earlier problem, what did we do? We had a tax and it shifted the supply curve. So you could use a tax so that the supply curve plus the tax exactly matches up with society's marginal cost. Just like we could use a subsidy to solve the positive externality problem. Now, the other tools we had here, we don't just have to use a tax. We said we could use price ceilings, price floors, or quotas as well. Okay. Now I forget who had the original question, but did that answer get you? And then I think we had you next, right? 26? So we did go over 26 at the beginning, right? Or a question similar, but we can kind of revisit this one. So this is probably an easier question than I would ask you on the exam because it only focuses on one good. So when we started out class, I gave you an example where I said, you should be able to know how to do this for two goods, right? So if you want to kind of go through a similar one, right? So this one should be easier. So I have an old example, so iPods, right? So they're normal goods, the price goes up. So from the substitution effect, and I've got the income effect. So here, I didn't even tell you what the other good was. Let's say I did just to make this question a little bit more interesting. So if these are normal goods, right? Let's say I add in an inferior good, which is, I don't know, actual physical CDs, right? So if I've got kind of my iPods here, my CDs, I can break this down into two different types of effects. So the first one should always be easy. It's just I buy whatever is relatively cheaper, less of whatever is relatively more expensive. So when it comes to kind of these iPod or these, iPods, I guess, am I going to buy more or less than I was before? The prices went up, so I'm going to buy less of those. What has become relatively cheaper? CDs, so I'm going to buy more of those, right? The substitution, if you draw this out, should always be working in opposite directions for these two goods, okay? Now, the income effect, what happens to my real income? Remember, real income is income over prices. If prices go up, what did we say happens to real income? It goes down, which for a normal good means I'm going to buy less of it. But for an inferior good, I'm actually going to buy, well, notice here, this would be an easy one for me to ask you the total effect of because what happens, right? They're pushing them in the same direction. Okay? So they might not always do that, like in the previous example, which is maybe why I gave you the previous example because that one's a little bit trickier and might look a little bit more like what you see on the exam, okay? but you could solve an easier one like this hopefully as well. Okay. Any other questions people had or wanted to see kind of work through? Yeah. Yeah, so I uploaded the practice problems again. I think it was on Friday, or maybe it might have been early yesterday. So I changed the wording a little bit here to be technically more correct. So the information that you were given is that at a quantity of 10, your average variable cost would be 20. And then if you produce the 11th unit, your marginal cost is 18. And you're asked about what is the new average variable cost at that 11th unit. So what you have to use here is the relationship between marginal and average costs, right? So I would draw out the depiction instead of just looking at the numbers, because it's, I think, going to make this a lot easier, okay? So if I'm drawing out the cost curve of a firm, average total cost is going to have this kind of U shape to it. Average variable cost will be what? Above or below my average total? Well, I've got those equations. How do I find my total costs? I add up my fixed and variable costs. So my average total would be the sum of my average fixed and my average variable. So average total cost will always be greater than or less than my average variable costs. Greater. Now what happens to my average fixed cost as I produce more? It's getting closer and closer to. So the difference between my average variable and average total is getting smaller and smaller. So that's where we said we can kind of think about my average variable cost will always be below average total, but it's getting closer and closer, right? Now, what will end up being true is my marginal cost curve hits those averages at their minimum point. Okay, so I'm trying to draw this as best to scale as I can. So I'm currently at a point where what? My marginal cost is below the average variable cost. So where am I looking at on this graph? I'm looking at a quantity where the average variable cost is actually above my marginal cost, right? Am I saying this wrong? I'm getting some confused looks. My marginal cost is 18. That's less than 20, right? So at a quantity of 10, right, when I move to that 11th unit, my marginal cost of 18 is below my old average of 20. So I always describe this relationship to people in terms of your grade. If your current average score in the class is a 70, you can get a 60 on the exam. That's what's your new, what's added in. Your new average score is going to be lower. So if my marginal cost is below my old average, my new average is going to be what? Lower. Or my average variable costs here are decreasing. Right? So I know my new average variable cost, because the marginal cost was less than the old average, has to be a little bit lower. Okay? Now, as soon as my marginal cost is above the old average, what's happening to my new average? Well, if I have a 70 in the class and I get a 90 on the exam, my new average will be higher, or my average variable cost should be increasing. Okay? Now, another thing that I might point out here, just to kind of might be useful on the exam. Let's say I didn't give you any information about the average variable cost or the average fixed cost. But if I know that the average total, so let's use this example, and I say the marginal cost is 18 and the average total cost is 10. So now I'm looking at a situation where the marginal cost is above my average total. What should be happening to my new average total? It should be higher. Well, what should also be true about my new average variable? The point where it hits the minimum on my average variable will always be at a quantity that's less than where it hits the minimum of my average total. So if the marginal cost is ever above my average total costs, I know it's going to have to be above my average variable costs. So if my marginal cost is ever above my average total cost, inherently that implies it's also above my average variable. So both of those must be increasing. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Where are we at in time? Okay. Yeah.
The quantity was like after the marginal cost passed the.
Well, I know it's not true because I told you the marginal cost at 18, or sorry, the marginal cost at 11 is 18. So my new marginal cost is below the old average. So my new average has to be lower. Yeah, if I asked you about like the 13th or 14th unit, all bets are off, right? But because I'm telling you the marginal cost of the next unit and it's below my old average, my new average has to be a little bit lower. Okay. Any other questions on this one? Any other questions people want to see worked through? Yeah, so 8, once again, I think this should be one, if I give you a question like this, which I might, should be a relatively easy question. Right? So if I'm thinking about who bears more of the burden of a tax, it's going to depend on whoever is more responsive, or if I'm more responsive, I am more, we got to know this going into the exam. So if I am more responsive to a price change, I am more elastic. Good. You guys are scaring me, right? So really what I'm doing is simply comparing the absolute value of my elasticities. What represents being more elastic? An elasticity value that is higher, right? The further away from 0 represents more elastic. So in this example, I think it was like negative 0.9 and 0.5. Who is more elastic? Who has the higher elasticity value? 0.9 is greater than 0.5, right? I'm just looking at the size or the magnitude or the absolute value. So if consumers are more elastic, they can avoid the burden of the tax, which means who is going to bear more of the burden? Producers. If I want to think about it the opposite way, who is going to be more inelastic? Whoever has a lower value. If I'm inelastic, I'm not responsive. If I don't respond to a truck driving at me, what's going to happen to the burden that I'm going to bear? Insanely high. If I am not responsive or I am more inelastic, can I avoid the burden? No, I'm going to bear a lot more of the burden. So you can think of it either two ways, right? For whatever reason, it helps me to think about whoever is responsive can avoid it, which means the other person will bear more of the burden. But if it helps you to think about it as whoever is not responsive is going to get hit by a damn truck, they're going to bear more of the burden. That way works as well, right? But to determine who is more or less elastic, you're just comparing the absolute values of those elasticities that are given to you. And I won't make you calculate them. It'll be very similar to this problem or the problem if you go back in the old practice exam or quiz, I forget which one, or that's a practice exam, practice problems. I'm just giving you what those elasticity measures are, okay? Any other questions that people want to see worked through? Yeah, so this is where I would have this idea, like, I don't know, tattooed on my arm going into the exam, right? So what should be true? I've got video games and movie tickets. If I'm maximizing utility, what should be the same for both of those goods? The marginal. I did this for you guys earlier. The point where my budget constraint and my indifference curve have the same slope is just a different way of saying the marginal utility per dollar should be the same for both goods, right? So here I'm thinking about if I'm spending optimally, the marginal utility per dollar should be the same for both goods. So if I know this is 40, or actually, what did I give you in this problem? Hold on. What was this, 21? Okay, I have prices, sorry. So the price here is 40, price here is 10. I would say an easy way to think about this, if I'm asking you about what must be true about the marginal utilities of these two goods, if they are both equal, why don't I just set them both equal to, what would be a good value to set them equal to? 1. Because if they're both 1, what does the marginal utility of a movie ticket have to be? How do I make a fraction equal to 1? The numerator and the denominator have to be the same thing. So what would the marginal utility of a video game have to be? 40. What's true about the marginal utility of a video game relative to a movie ticket? It is greater. In fact, I can actually say, using this simple thought experiment, how much greater does it need to be? 4 times as large, or essentially, what's the marginal rate of substitution here? 4. Right? That's all that that's saying. Right? Now here I simplified it and just simply ask you about the directional change, right? But if I just rearrange this, what is the marginal rate of substitution? This would be the marginal utility of a video game over the marginal utility of a movie ticket, which I know should be the same as the price of a video game over the price of a movie ticket. This is my marginal rate of substitution. If I plug these prices in, sure enough, I get my marginal rate of substitution is 4. Just a different way of thinking about it, right? I think thinking about it as though when I'm spending optimally, the marginal utility per dollar is the same for both goods. Set that equal to 1, and that'll tell you what has to be true about what the values of your marginal utilities, right? I would kind of maybe approach it that way, and then it becomes very obvious. Oh yeah, if both of these are going to be equal to 1, this marginal utility has to be 40, this one has to be 10. I know which one has to be larger. Okay. Any other questions on this one? 30. Yeah. So this is a good one. So I'm going to go through 30, and then I'm going to go through one that I think would be helpful for you guys to review. Okay. So on 30, I filled this column in for my last class. So remind me, I think we didn't have this, and we didn't have any of these values, right? Is that what it looks like to you guys? Hopefully, okay. So this is where when I give you tables like this, only use the values you see in this table. Do not infer things about what should be true about average variable marginal cost increasing or decreasing, because when I want you to use this table, I'm not concerned about the concepts of directional changes, so I don't want you to be able to rule things out. I want you to be able to actually compute the values. So I'm going to show you maybe a type of question I could give you, right? So first of all, what has to be true about my fixed costs? When I produce nothing, my variable costs are 0. So that means all of my costs are fixed. I could fill out that total fixed cost column right away. Okay? Now, if I'm thinking about what my marginal costs are, and I'm looking at that second unit, okay? Well, what's my marginal, or sorry, what is my total cost at that quantity of 1? I think I would have what? My total variable plus my total fixed is 710. So if I wanted the kind of marginal cost of that second unit, what I need to do is figure out what my total cost is here, right? Did I delete a value here? So I want marginal cost of the second unit. I need my total costs. Did I have 50 in the original table? Yeah, okay, that makes more sense. I was going to say, how the hell would I ask you guys this question? So I had 50. What's the total cost of the second unit? Total fixed plus total variable. What's the change in my total costs? 40. How do I find marginal costs? So my marginal cost, and this is an equation you'll have on the back side, is the change in my total cost over the change in quantity. This is an example where the change in quantity were easy because they were always 1. That won't always be the case. I'd worked through maybe the one that we had in the quiz and some of the stuff in class where sometimes the jump in quantity is like 10 or 5. Oh, sorry. So which one did I? Okay, sorry. I should have probably reopened this. This was left out, but this was included, right? 750 was included. Okay, same difference, right? We actually I could make it harder and I could have left this out and included 50, so we had to then calculate total cost, right? But either way, we now have that total cost of the first and the second unit. So if my marginal cost is the change in the total cost divided by a change in quantity, my marginal cost here would be what? 40 over 1 or 40. Right? Now, let's say I did something different because I might do something like this on the exam, right? Let's say instead, I don't know. Let's go back to that example. Let's say I did something like this. So let's say I left these two out. And let's say I left, just for the sake of this example, let's say I left all this out. And I did 50 here. Well, if the change in the marginal cost is the change in my total cost, I've got a problem. Because how do I find my fixed costs here? I mean, I don't have average fixed costs. I don't have any costs at zero. I couldn't. Doesn't matter. What is the change in my fixed cost as I change my production? The change in my fixed cost will always be zero. They don't change. So where is the change in my total cost coming from? It's only coming from my variable cost. So if I wanted to, I could also think about when calculating, my marginal cost, it's the change in my total variable cost divided by a change in quantity. These should be the same thing. So before we found 40 using the total cost, if I only had variable costs, what's the change in my total variable costs? 40 over 1 or 40 as well. So I can use either those total costs to calculate marginal cost, or if I gave you an example where you only had the variable cost, you can use the change in your variable costs in that numerator as well. Okay? And that comes from the fact that we know fixed costs don't change with my production decision. So those fixed costs aren't influencing the change in my total cost at all. The only change in my total cost is coming from changes in my variable cost. Okay? Any questions on anything there? Yeah.
That talks about fixed costs, that's short term, right?
If I have any fixed costs, I know that I'm in the short run. So if I see any value other than zero in the average fixed cost or the total fixed cost column, I know I'm in the short run. If I see a zero in those columns, I know I'm in the long run. Yep. Okay. Any other questions over anything here? I just want to mention one more thing before we move on. You will definitely see a question kind of like 29, where I might not ask you about totals, but you've got to be able to do this, and you've got the equations on the back of the exam. If I tell you the average total cost, that's my total cost over quantity. If I give you average variable cost, that's total variable cost over quantity. So if I give you any two of these pieces of information, you should always be able to solve for the third. I would write these equations out, do the actual algebra, and not just try to think about it in my head. For example, if I don't look at the equation and I say, what's the total cost of the fourth unit? I go, okay, that's just, and I'm looking at averages. Okay, I'm dividing 200 over 4 is 50. Well, that's wrong, right? Because the average is equal to my total over quantity. So what do I actually need to do to solve for that total? Take the average and multiply it. Do the if I write it out, I'll see, oh yeah, I multiply that 200 by 4, giving me that total cost must be 800. Did I reference? Yeah, I got those values right. Okay. All right. So one other key concept I would know how to be able to do, and we'll get rid of this, and I'll ask you this question 27. Now, I didn't have this column on the actual practice exam. I'm just going to add it in here so I can kind of not have to jump back and forth. Okay. So if I'm thinking about the marginal product of labor, that means it's how much my output is changing by every time I hire additional workers. So it's the change in my output divided by a change in the quantity of labor or the number of workers. So what would the marginal productivity of labor be at that 15th unit? Well, output is going up by 15. How much is my number of workers going up by? Well, I kept it nice and easy, always 5 here. So 3. Now, a harder question. So this is where, like, this is a good set of questions to review. I'm going through stuff today probably for a reason. So the next two types of questions might be really good to know how to solve. If I asked you instead not to just give me the marginal product of labor, but is the firm experiencing gains from specialization or diminishing returns? What do I need to know about this directional change of the marginal productivity of labor to determine that? If I've got gains from specialization, my marginal productive labor should be going. If I have diminishing returns, it should be going. So what do I actually need to know the marginal productive labor of? The workers, number of workers right before that as well. So here, what's the marginal productivity of labor at the 10th unit? Well, there the change in output is 30 divided by a change in the quantity of labor of 5. So 30 over 5 is 6. If my marginal productivity of labor is going down, what do I have? Diminishing returns, right? If it was increasing, I would say I know that I have gains from specialization. Now, I could also ask you a question, and I could go in either direction. So I'll tell you from this, and then I'll throw in one more. At that 15th unit of labor, or said differently, at that 65th unit of output, what must be happening to the firm's marginal costs? So if my workers are becoming what here? More or less productive? Less productive, so my marginal cost must be going up. Anytime I have diminishing returns to labor, we said we have increasing marginal costs, right? So if I'm thinking about the connection between those two, if I'm looking at the quantity of labor and output, we said we know the marginal productivity of labor curve looks something like this, where initially it's increasing because of gains from specialization, and then it begins to decrease because of diminishing returns, okay? There's an inverse relationship, Q or output here, that when I've got gains from specialization, my workers are becoming more productive. Every single unit, the additional cost is actually lower, or I've got decreasing marginal costs. Then when my labor becomes less productive, that means every unit I want to make, I'm going to have to hire more workers, so my costs are actually going up. So if you tell me that there's diminishing returns to labor, I know my marginal cost must be increasing. I know if I've got gains from specialization, my marginal cost must be decreasing. Now, if I go back and let's say I look at this table, okay? So I don't know, just for the sake of this example, I don't know if it matches up with these numbers, and I don't want to waste time in class to do this. So if let's say this was my marginal cost, right? And I say at that second of unit of output, what must be true about my marginal product of labor? Well, going from that first to the second unit, what's happening to my marginal costs? They're going 50 to 40, so they are decreasing. If my marginal costs are decreasing, that occurs because I have what in terms of labor? Gains from, so I know that when I want to produce that second unit, what will my workers be experiencing, or the workers in my firm would be experiencing? Gains from specialization. So I can go in either direction. If you tell me about, or you give me information to determine the directional change in marginal costs, I know what's happening to my marginal product of labor. If you tell me what's happening to my marginal product of labor, I could then tell you what's happening to that change in my marginal costs. I would know how to work in either of those directions, okay? And here, we probably even more difficult of an example, I would say, like here, then maybe I just kind of tell you what's happening to the, I tell you there's gains, and then you would know that the marginal cost must be decreasing or vice versa, okay? All right, where are we at in time? Okay. Any other, probably have time for more quick question here, or just any kind of logistical questions that anyone still want to kind of clear it up here? Yeah. So they don't switch, right? So I don't think I went through a full example. What if I probably don't have time because it does take some time. But what I would mention is I posted an additional video on subsidies. So the reason why both of them go up, I can do this real quick, all right? So we've got supply, we've got demand, right? If I've got a subsidy, right? I said we could think of it as though I'll usually only give this to you modeled through the demand curve. So this new price, when I have a subsidy, this is going to be the price that the seller gets to keep. If I then take away the subsidy, that's going to be the price the consumer pays. So notice with a subsidy, relative to that old equilibrium, consumers pay less, producers get to keep more. So what's going to happen to both producer and consumer surplus? They both go up. In fact, what is producer surplus? Well, what's the marginal benefit to producers? The price they keep. Their marginal cost is the supply curve. So they haven't flipped, right? It's still my triangle that's like on the bottom. It's just a really big triangle now. What's producers or consumer surplus? The area below demand, but above this new lower price consumers pay. So it's still the triangle that is like on top. It's just really big, right? So there's now overlap, but what has happened to both producer and consumer surplus? Unlike with taxes, where both of them were hurt, they now are both better off. Now, why does this cause deadweight loss in the market? Well, how did we fund this increase in surplus? Who is giving the subsidy? The government. So instead of tax revenue, we now have government expenditures. What does that equal to? The value of the subsidy times the quantity we see after the subsidy. So that would be represented by this big rectangle in the middle. Still kind of like taxes. Tax revenue is the rectangle in the middle. Government expenditure is now the rectangle in the middle. Notice those gains to producer and consumer surplus were like washed out by this new additional cost, right? So that gets subtracted out. So the only area where we don't have gains to producers and consumers, but we have additional costs to the government is this triangle here, which that would represent our deadweight loss. Yes, consumers and producers are better off. When we're thinking about social surplus, we had to pay for that with these huge government expenditures. Those huge expenditures were much larger than those gains to producers and consumers. Is that what you were kind of referencing? But I went through in that additional video on subsidies, I kind of like broke these pieces out and like drew them so you could kind of see a little bit more. So I would kind of go take a look back at that video. That might help just see a more like slowed down version, okay? All right, so before you get out of here, right? I guess we're all very excited to go. If I was going to tell you the question or the answer to question 22, I'm sure it'd be a lot quieter, right? So I've got this kind of survey up here. So before you leave today, so I think I've got it set. I think it's 38.14 is the code to kind of get in. So I hesitate to say this too early, so we'll make sure that's what it is. I think it was the score of the Colts game. So 38.14 should kind of get you into that quiz. I guess if you don't care about me at all or care about me catering the class to help you out, you can not pay attention to anything I'm saying now because this isn't for points, right? So this isn't in-class attendance. This is just a way for me to try to evaluate what people are struggling with, kind of the connection between actual exam scores and people's responses. So I'm not going to look at any one of your responses here. I'm going to look at the aggregate of the class, but I'd like you to answer 3 of the following questions before you leave. So what module going into this exam do you feel least confident about? If the average on the exam is a 75, where do you think your grade is going to fall, right? Which category? And then which of the following you find most helpful in kind of preparing for these exams? So kind of help me change things because the future modules might be more or less related to module 7 versus module 9. So I might need to know what I need to focus a little bit more on kind of after this exam. It also kind of gives me an idea of just kind of the over-under confidence and be able to make some statements to people as they're asking me or getting kind of worried about final exams. And then just your attendance today, I'm going to look at a correlation and provide you some linear regression results to see whether or not it was correlated with performance on the exam. I have an idea about what that correlation is going to look like. But 38.14 gets you into that quiz. Just making sure you're getting it submitted before you leave. That helps me out, helps me change things, cater things a little bit, and just get a little bit more information about what is being beneficial, what is not being beneficial for you guys. Okay? There's no points, right? So just respond. There's no correct answers. I just have to have something set in there so you can respond. It's not worth any points. So if you don't give a rat's ass about me, I guess don't do it. But it would help me kind of cater the class. And once again, if I told you the question, the answer to question 22 on the midterm number 2 exam will be answer. Oh, everybody stopped in the back, right? Okay. So I'm not telling you the answer. I'm trying to make a point. I'm trying to finish up. The louder you guys get, the slower you get out of here. So if you don't care at all, I'm guessing some of you in the back didn't care. Just try to respond to those. It helps me kind of cater the class moving forward to be a little bit more efficient for you guys. Okay. I'll be in my office hours as usual, 10. I have to be done right at 1 tomorrow. So if you have questions, get there early, but I will be there tomorrow if you have some last minute questions, and then I will see you on Thursday for the in-class exam. Okay. Thank you.